Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a question that some of the biggest industries on the planet, we're talking oil, gas, nuclear, have to ask themselves constantly. How safe is safe enough? And, to really get why this question is so critical, we've got to start with a single, pretty shocking number. It really shows you the true cost of getting safety wrong. So, back in the year 1900, that was the human cost of just going to work in Great Britain for 1 year. 4,400 people gone. They went to their jobs and just never came back home. I mean, it's a staggering figure, right? It really paints a picture of that era of heavy industry where there was hardly any regulation.
But then, look at this. Fast forward about a century, and that number just plummets. We're talking a drop of over 97%. It's honestly one of the biggest, but maybe least talked about, public health wins in modern history. Now sure, part of that was the shift away from heavy industry, but a huge piece of the puzzle was a total revolution in how we think about and manage risk.
And all of this amazing progress brings us right back to that fundamental question. We know we can't get risk down to zero. That's just not possible. So where do you draw the line? I mean, at what point does the cost, the time, the sheer effort to make something even a tiny bit safer just become impractical?
Well, for a lot of industries and regulators all over the world, the answer comes down to a simple but really powerful four-letter acronym. It's a framework for tackling this exact problem.
And that acronym is ALRP. It stands for as low as reasonably practicable. But, the real magic is in that last part, reasonably practicable. See, this isn't about getting rid of every single risk. That's impossible. It's about shrinking the risk down until the sacrifice to make it even smaller, we're talking money, time, whatever, is just completely out of whack, totally disproportionate to the tiny little bit of safety you'd gain.
And this idea has deep roots. This quote here is basically the legal heart of the whole principle. It comes from a UK court case from way back in 1949, and it's where this key concept of gross disproportion was established. And here's the crucial thing. It's not a simple 50-50 balance of cost versus benefit. Oh no, the scales are deliberately heavily tipped in favor of safety. You have to put in a safety measure, unless the cost to do so is grossly disproportionate.
Okay, so that's the legal theory. But how do you actually use this in the real world? How do you make it a practical tool? Well, the ALARP principle is often visualized with a really simple but super effective framework that puts every risk into one of three zones. So picture it like this. You've got three zones for risk. At the top, in the red zone, you have unacceptable risks. These are the ones you just have to fix, period. No debate. Down at the bottom, in the green zone, you have broadly acceptable risks. These are so small, they're basically just background noise. But the most important area is that big space in the middle, the tolerable zone. A risk can only live here if and only if you can prove you've done everything reasonably practicable to make it as small as possible.
All right, so let's talk about the gross disproportion test itself. How does a company actually prove that a risk sitting in that middle zone is low enough? How do you go from a principle to making a hard, justifiable decision?
So how do you do it? How do you actually prove that something is grossly disproportionate, especially when you're talking about really high-stakes hazards, things that could potentially lead to fatalities? Well, you can't just rely on a gut feeling, right? You need a real, concrete way to quantify that decision. Okay, check this out. These are two real-world examples from the chemical company AkzoNobel, and they show exactly how this works. They use a calculation called the implied cost of averting a fatality, or ICAF. Basically, think of it as the price tag for saving a life with a specific safety upgrade. In the first example, the ICAF is a massive 18 million euros. Since that's way, way higher than their internal cutoff of 13.3 million, the cost is officially grossly disproportionate. They don't have to do it. But now look at example 2. The cost is 6.7 million euros. That's below their threshold of 20 million. So the cost is reasonable, and that means they have to implement it. It's a clear, data-driven way to make a really tough call.
Now, it's really important to understand that this isn't just some quirky idea from one company or something that only happens in one country. This way of thinking has become a cornerstone of safety regulations all over the world.
And yeah, the exact letters might change a bit depending on where you are. You might hear ALARP or SFARP in Australia, or maybe ALARA in the Netherlands. But the core idea, that fundamental principle of balancing risk against a grossly disproportionate sacrifice, it's mandated by law in many of the world's most safety-focused countries. It really gives everyone a common language to talk about risk. So why is this framework so important? Well, because the economic stakes are just mind-blowing. Take a look at this number. 15 billion pounds. That's the annual cost of workplace injuries and ill health.
In Great Britain alone. Just let that sink in for a moment.
But here's the kicker. Who actually pays that massive bill? You might think it's all on the employers, but they only bear about 20% of it. As this chart shows, the vast majority, a full 57%, falls directly on individuals and their families. We're talking lost income, a lower quality of life. It's a huge personal cost. And then the government, which means us, the taxpayers, picks up another 23%. And that right there is why having a clear, structured process like ALARP is so incredibly important.
All right, so let's wrap this up with the key takeaways. First, workplace safety has gotten dramatically better, but the cost of things going wrong is still massive. Second, ALRP is the framework that helps us decide when a risk is safe enough. It's all about that balance, right? Reducing risk unless the sacrifice to do more is grossly disproportionate. And finally, the whole point isn't to chase the impossible dream of zero risk. It's about having a transparent, smart, and defensible process for managing the risks that are left.
And that really leaves us with one final thought to chew on. The real power of a concept like ALRP isn't some magic number or perfect formula. It's that it forces us to have a conscious, open, and transparent conversation about risk and responsibility. So it makes you wonder, right? How does your organization or your team, or even just you in your daily work, how do you decide what's truly safe enough?